let's take all of that information, the studies in terms of controllability, emotional expression, and so forth, and try and understand a fairly common diagnosis when we're talking about fatigue, and that's chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, this clearly is diagnosed in women 3 to 4 times more often than in men. And quite frankly, part of the reason why this literature, from a research perspective, is kind of a mess is that there's been a lack of diagnostic clarity. Well, over the last several years, the CDC's definition really is now stuck, and most people around the globe are using this to clearly see, is this person have chronic fatigue, and then let's study what works and what doesn't. Well, chronic fatigue for more than 6 months that doesn't get better with bed rest, and importantly, it impairs functioning by at least 50%. There's also this exhaustion after a completion of simple tasks. We have you walk 50 yards, you're exhausted. You go up 1 flight of stairs, you're not able to do things for the rest of the day. Then there's at least 7 out of 11 of the following symptoms that are present to meet criteria. The symptom that really is most important or debilitating for the patient must be the one that had a relatively sudden onset. It could include any of the following: fever and chills, sore throat, enlarged or painful lymph nodes. This is where it starts to get a little murky and a lot of crossover with fibromyalgia. Generalized muscle weakness and muscle pain or myalgias. Post-exertional malaise. We have you walk up 1 flight of stairs, come back and do some of the same simple puzzles and problems to solve as you were able to do just 10 minutes ago. You can't. You have a really hard time focusing, concentrating, having a working short-term memory. The presence of headaches, joint aches, as well as neuropsych complaints, absolutely sleep disturbances, as well as non-productive congestion. Just a general sense that I've got phlegm at a really low level, but I just can't get rid of. Now, because again, given time, how I'm going to choose to try and share with you the literature in a way that it's often portrayed as 2 different camps. There's this set of researchers who are saying, you know what, this is a psychological phenomenon. This is psychosomatic illness. And there's others who are saying, oh no, it's a biomedical. Something is definitely wrong. We're just having a hard time really finding specifically what's wrong. Well, there is ample evidence for the psychological, pure psychosomatic argument because lots of studies show that there's really no difference in the metabolism between patients with chronic fatigue syndrome and those without. So it must be psychological. And you know that thing they say, that post-exertional malaise, that's just a lack of motivation to perform well on the tasks. Well, you got to understand that kind of cognitive ability, our brain is a major consumer of resting cellular energy. So maybe some of these cognitive difficulties are symptomatic of a central nervous system dysfunction. Now, they do say they've got more than a dozen studies showing that the odds ratios are always at least 1.6 or higher. People with chronic fatigue are at least 60%, sometimes 400% more likely to report a history of abuse as a child. They are much more likely to report a childhood dotted with GI problems. As young kids and adolescents throughout their young lives, they're reporting being more sick, or reporting colds and flus, more sick days over their kindergarten through 12 years than patients who don't have chronic fatigue. And finally, they point to the outcomes, because when you look at the outcomes studies, the best outcomes are associated with people who have a lowering of their perceived problems with activity and an increase in a sense of control. Literally, some of these studies are so mean that they say, oh, Mrs. Thompson, very, very sophisticated ways we have to measure your stamina, and you've improved 15%. Way to go. Well, that actually wasn't true, but that subject then says, oh yeah, I feel about 15-20% better, right? So they're using that as evidence that placebo effect, purely psychological. Well, now wait a minute. Let's start looking at where a lot of the data is now coming from, showing, first of all, when glucocorticoids are present, stress-induced or otherwise, they're going to release, as part of that, the glucocorticoids are released, they're going to destroy older and weaker lymphocytes. The problem is that if that stress is prolonged and chronic elevations of glucocorticoids, they aren't as discriminating and they just kind of kill off lymphocytes indiscriminately. And if in fact you pair that with kind of a lack of compensating or returning back to baseline, chronically elevated levels of stress without returning to baseline actually then starts to increase your risk of autoimmune disorders. What about the fact that chronic fatigue patients don't have the same seasonal variation in their fatigue as you find in mood disorders? Mood disorders, even if it's not seasonal affective disorder, there's some seasonal variation. If this is a masked depression, you're not seeing that same kind of variation or trend. You also look at the cognitive kind of acquisition problems these patients have. Could be a central nervous system deficit. And the most consistent finding for the last 20 years, patients with chronic fatigue have lower levels of cortisol in the morning. They don't generally differ consistently when you compare them to healthy controls for about 20 hours of the day. Where they differ the most is between about 7 and 11 a.m., when most of us have 4, 5, 6 times as much cortisol surging through our blood. These patients may be at doubling, which is seen as a blip on the screen. Now, in addition, you kind of understand the fact that when we have pro-inflammatory cytokines are kind of like the foot soldiers of the immune system, they're going to cause sickness behavior with autoimmune disorders. Epstein-Barr virus. Actually, Kiko Glaser was one of those that was publishing a lot of data back in the 80s, and Epstein-Barr was kind of getting a lot of attention, thinking that maybe that's what's going on. But it kind of fell into disfavor in large part because the assays were criticized for being unreliable. But now they've started to revisit this literature and do more recent studies, and they show that Epstein-Barr virus and other viral proteins are again going to result in this release of pro-inflammatory cytokines that result in the fever, the aching, and so forth. Now, when you have such activation and the cytokine release, that's going to stimulate T cell development. Okay? However, if chronic elevations of cytokines are present, you actually have a diminishing of T cell counts, as well as natural killer cell cytotoxicity, and that is what you see in chronic fatigue patients. Now, here is some pretty provocative research showing that compared to those without chronic fatigue, those with chronic fatigue after exposure to mononucleosis, had altered gene expression profiles. They had altered host response. That is, what is now being surmised is when you and I have been exposed to mononucleosis, and we recover within weeks or what have you, that patients with chronic fatigue more often are showing that their immune systems are permanently altered as a result of that exposure. Sometimes to Epstein-Barr as well as mono. Now, it's not clear if, in fact, chronic fatigue may be an expression of an Epstein-Barr virus, or that viral exposure, that mono and so forth, actually has altered their ability, these patients, to respond to viral challenges. You and I, all the time, are exposed to different viruses, but we go about our days without, much notice. For these patients, their immune systems may be compromised so much that they're chronically reflecting the fatigue that this activation is symbolic of. If you read this literature at all, you'll recall back in 2009 in the journal Science, highly respected peer-reviewed literature, a team out of University of Nevada, Reno, published data showing that what they were referring to as the XM retrovirus was seen in 70% of patients with chronic fatigue and less than 15% of healthy controls. That was all the buzz for about a year and a half. But in the last 3 years, there have been 5 replications of that study, including one by the original team. Nobody's been able to duplicate those findings. What they now realize is that the assay, the methodology used to assess this retrovirus is fairly faulty. Now let's keep on piling on the literature that kind of makes this argument. Remember those studies that the psychosomatic camp was arguing it's a psychological issue? That, these kids had GI problems throughout? Well, if your digestive system is operating as it should, it's going to kind of take glucose along with lipids and others, combine with red blood cells, and supply the essential elements to the mitochondria within cells, and you get energy. If you have a defective GI system, you're not going to have that same energy, and most immunologists would argue that at least 2/3 of our immune system is housed in our gastrointestinal system. In brief, inside the cell, this glucose is broken down for the use by the mitochondria. This dysfunction, if this doesn't occur, is going to result in fatigue. And what do you often now see in studies? There's a reported impairment of the recycling of ATP in the mitochondria for patients with chronic fatigue. 3 months ago, additional data from the National Academy of Sciences. They did a white paper, reviewed the literature. They were looking at the impact actually of sleep and sleep dysregulation, what they call an arrhythmic circadian clock that's primarily going to be achieved, if you will, by doing shift work or having a delayed phase sleep disorder. They see the constant expression of pro-inflammatory proteins. Their conclusion, the evidence suggests the best way to offset that is by exercise, because that's how you increase anti-inflammatory proteins. And finally, you and I, you are subject to my study. You come in and I squeeze a tourniquet around your arm until you cry uncle. Okay? That may take 3-4 minutes before you say, okay, that's enough pain. Then you go on a treadmill for 20 or 30 minutes. Go at a pretty brisk pace, 4.5, 5.5 miles per hour. After 30 minutes, you stop. I do the same kind of pain induction procedure. Your pain tolerance has gone up as a result of exercise. Just the opposite is found for patients with chronic fatigue, and most people are now looking at, researchers who do this, are looking at why cortisol actually, those levels might be implicated in part of this pain perception process. So in summation, 2 people who are highly respected and have a pretty balanced view here. One says, there's generally consensus among clinicians and academics, and only a very small but vocal minority giving the impression of polarization within the field. Unfortunately, we know from the vaccination and autism saga that polarization makes for better media coverage. While immune dysfunction is associated with chronic fatigue, we don't know if this plays an etiologic role or is simply confounded with low cortisol and sleep dysfunction. Both low cortisol and sleep dysfunction are common in chronic fatigue and both are associated with immune activation. Now, cross-sectional studies that compare patients with chronic fatigue to other medical conditions show that the proportion of patients with chronic fatigue have a rate of comorbid psychological disorders, read depression, that's too high to simply be a reaction to having the illness, but is compatible with the idea that the comorbidity, depression, might reflect a shared underlying central nervous system dysfunction. And the other, again, pretty balanced approach of common sense here. Chronic fatigue has multiple causes, so to call it a single disease greatly underestimates the complexity of the problem. To look for the cause of chronic fatigue is self-defeating. There's accumulating evidence for a wide variety of abnormalities in chronic fatigue, including altered immunity, disordered pain perception, endocrine abnormalities, sleep disorders, and cardiovascular dysfunction. However, one is left with a strong sense that post-viral events are a common trigger in chronic fatigue, but how they lead to chronic disease remains unresolved. This, to me, seems to be a classic example of epigenetics. Some people may be genetically predisposed that whether it be Epstein-Barr, mono, or other type of viral challenge, there's a much more dramatic alteration of the immune system, and as a result, there's changes, whether it be cardiovascular dysfunction, inflammation, other inflammatory processes, sleep dysfunctions, and like. Now, fortunately, we don't wait for some definitive study to show us there's one cause of this problem before we start studying and testing what works and what doesn't. Evidence-based behavioral medicine, EBBM, for chronic fatigue, hands down, number one most effective intervention, not only for fibromyalgia, but for chronic fatigue, is stepped activity, including pool-based exercise. This is so clear, I refuse to see any patient who does not agree to at least twice a week participate in warm water, pool-based exercise. I'd be wasting my time talking about psychological factors if we didn't also do this. This is stepped, so it's not like in 2 weeks or even 2 months you're going to see dramatic improvements. But the best outcomes are with multi-component programs that always include kind of a gradual increase in range of motion, muscle strength, and stamina as a result of the warm buoyancy that the water provides. Because you'll often ask these patients kind of, have you tried this, stretching before? Oh no, that makes things worse. Well, they will often, because you're dealing with women, high-functioning women in their 30s and 40s, they want their life back. They tend to kind of go at it too hard and too fast. And people will consistently come up to me and say, you know what, you did speak the truth. I'm not back at 100%, but it took me about 9 months to a year. I'm at about 80%, and I've got my life back. There's some things I have to accommodate to, but this was huge. Educating people, differentiating between facts and fiction, sharing them with them what we know about the immune-mediated processes and the data there, CBT, stress management, kind of are there things that we can help them with that sense of control that would be important? Are there kind of different ways to think about things, lowering the stress? Because if in fact they chronically feel out of control, that's only going to be exacerbating and prolonging the problem. Antidepressant medication, here's a tough sell. Because patients will often be dismissed. Oh, I don't know, go see the psychologist, try an antidepressant, right? Well, the data though is pretty clear that even when you test them in every single way and they're not depressed, 30 to 35% of patients who are tried maybe several different trials of an antidepressant, usually SSRIs, will benefit from that. That will contribute to it. It won't be the sole kind of factor. And about a third of patients saying you might need to try 3 or 4 different types of medication. Dietary monitoring, to some degree. If there's some things, whether it be sleep hygiene, sleep restriction, smaller meals, energy intake and expenditure, those things are helpful. This is the only group I know of where there is peer-reviewed studies demonstrating that they need to take a nap. Midday naps, 30 minutes, results in higher productivity for the next 2 to 3 hours. And I work with some physicians who write prescriptions so the patient can take it to their supervisor and say, I'm not asking for time off, let me just take another lunch break at about 2:30 or 3 for 30 minutes. I'll stay later so I can make up that half hour, but I want to be productive. And that actually is demonstrated in peer-reviewed studies.